Hello there, I am Cielle Backstrom, a Trillium Awakening Teacher, and I'm here today with Leigh, who has been a teacher for more than 18 years. I first met Cece in 2002 when I was first getting involved with Waking Down, and she was my teacher for several years, actually. And one thing I've also really appreciated about Cece in terms of her contributions to this work is that she's an excellent writer. And our website, our current website, is evidence of how clear a writer she is, because she actually did contribute many of the essays to that website. And in fact, she has a book. She'll be telling us a little bit about her book during this interview right now. But I asked Cece especially to meet with me today because she was one of the main authors for an essay that we have on our website that's called Guidelines for Mutuality. And Cece and a few other teachers put these guidelines together because they had encountered over years of experience where there could be some kind of pitfalls or hidden places in terms of mutuality that we would fall into unknowingly. And being that mutuality is such an important part of our work, some guidelines were created. And I'm especially hoping that which of these guidelines would be useful for peer-based groups, mutuality circles. And so I invited Cece to come here today to just share some of what she learned over her, especially early years with this work and early years as a teacher, that contribute into creating this document, and just see what you want to pass on to people as anything of the history, any gems of wisdom, whatever you feel you'd like to share with us today, Cece.
Hi, Cielle, and thank you for inviting me into this conversation about mutuality and the guidelines. And I'll say we call them the guidelines for practicing mutuality. Kind of an important word because they're a bit like training wheels. If you learn how to get into doing mutuality. So mutuality is a great, absolutely brilliant framework that's so important to this work. One of the three petals of the trillium flower. So there's awakening, there's embodiment, but there's also the relatedness and mutuality that has proven to be so to awakening and to coming fully alive in your embodied experience of your awakened self. And also how to have in your relationships so that they begin to be a reflection of a more conscious way of than what we've been taught, what we grew up with, what we learned in our families or our school or in our early peer-to-peer experiences, which were often rough. And didn't really give us room or space to be truly called forward into our whole true, authentic, real expression that, that really just enriches life immensely when you get there. So I want to give you kind of a definition that was created by Samuel Bonder when he was in the kind of defining stages of developing his work. And it is that mutuality involves being true to your true and total self in all communication and action, while simultaneously honoring and cooperating with others who are doing the same themselves. Well, that all sounds great if you're able to cooperate. But too often what we were experiencing in the early days was that people took the first part of that, oh, I get to be true to my true and total self. That means I get to say anything that pops into my mind. I get to spew or dump on people if that's what I'm feeling in the moment. And I get to, I get to come in the room and be expressed. And that can be a very good thing. I don't mean that's a bad thing. It's just that it can be kind of rough. And what was happening is that other people in the room would at times feel pushed out, would feel backed up. They would not feel safe when people were coming into with too much, too forcefully, or just too callously, and not really able to fully be sensitive to the other who was in the room, or the others who were in the room. So as safety went down, people then weren't being called forward. They weren't feeling safe enough to let that little tender, beautiful spark in them that was coming alive and needing to be nurtured. There wasn't enough care around that. So as we went along and began teaching, especially courses like advanced mutuality skills, then there was all to look at, okay, how do we help people get more of the framework of what mutuality is and can be? And how do we support people who maybe aren't so fully awakened to their non-separateness with the other, that they don't fully feel empathy all the time yet? And so we started seeing things that were not creating senses of safety. So that's kind of where it started. Before a course came along, we looked at, okay, what are the things that are undermining safety, so that people are hesitating to feel invited here, or to feel that they can come forward here. And God, I will say that one of the things I think is very key to how we practice mutuality together is that we do create, and I know it's not about rules very often, but there is one rule that I think is very important, and that's no fixing. So it comes from a place of honoring each person's own being as wise and divine and capable, and not assuming that just because they're telling me something's wrong that I need to jump in and give them some suggestions on how to fix themselves. What we found is observing how that plays out with people is that, and played out with me for sure. As soon as somebody started telling me how to fix myself, it was like, I kind of pulled the shell back around myself. It's like I didn't feel heard. I didn't feel seen. I didn't feel room to be. And I didn't feel room to kind of figure it out for myself. Maybe you can relate to that some yourself.
Yeah, I totally can. And thank you. But I just love that the simplicity, if we're going to remember just one thing when we're in mutuality with someone else, that practice of just no need to fix,
Right.
just to hold and make room and trust that things will unfold as they're supposed to unfold. And that fixing tendency is really a non-trusting orientation. So thank you for just that really clear reminder of such an important principle of this work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So of course there's other things that undermine safety. I have them here somewhere. This is one of the first little things that we we put together that form the basis for the guidelines. When one person dominates the space, then other people don't feel like there's room or that they can feel safe. When people get too heady or too abstract or too conceptualizing, when they're making it all about something that they studied out of a book, then people disconnect. and don't feel invited. Certainly anger that blasts and blames very much undermines a sense of safety. It's not that anger is inherently wrong. I don't mean to imply that. And anger used well and consciously can be a very powerful tool and can really contribute to embodiment and to creating good boundaries. But that doesn't come from a place of making others wrong or blasting and blaming them. So giving feedback before people are ready to hear it can also undermine safety. So that expanded from there into what we call these guidelines for practicing, which are, these are places to start. And I believe along with this video, you'll have a link to the guidelines document. So you might want to open that as you're listening or after you listen to this.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Because they're a little long. I don't want to read through the whole thing right now. It's more important just to talk about it. So we started working on these. Well, I believe we wrote the first draft and used the first draft back in 2008. And so that's more than a decade now of these guidelines that proves that they've really stood the test of time and have created a framework for people to be invited, to feel safe, to also give people some ideas for how they might be with one another in a way that draws each other out and helps them feel connected. And again, they're not meant to be a straitjacket. They're not meant to be hard and fast. You have to do it this way, or you're not doing mutuality, because it's not the whole picture. You know, how we learn to do it involves some care until we kind of get the feel of it. And part of the feel of it is really deep listening, learning to attune your ear to what the other is saying and how they're using language or how they're hesitating to use language. But you listen deeply and then just finding simple ways to reflect back whatever it is that you're picking up from them. And that helps the other person know they're actually getting through to you, which again creates a positive feedback loop, a positive invitation for them to say more, to explore, to maybe investigate within themselves more deeply, because they're being heard and being invited.
Yeah, so thank you so far. I'm really myself being very honored and touched to hear this directly from you, Cici. You know, there's such clarity here, and because you own this material so well, and how that, you know, that these are not fast rules, but they are guidelines to create safety so that we can drop into who we are. We can, you know, we don't have to have those barriers of protective barriers in place, because we can be so fully received by the other that we feel the freedom to be who we are. And it's in that freedom of being who we are that the awakening can happen. So I love the way you're framing the value of investigating these very practical considerations. And I was going to invite you, just if there are a few key ones that you'd like to share right now on this, you know, in this recording, I'd love to hear what you consider to be key ones.
Okay, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. As you were speaking, I was just thinking that these became really important as people were forming peer mutuality groups, because teacher groups, originally, most of the groups were teacher-led, and we called them sittings. So the teacher would be the one who is principally in charge of creating a sense of safety. And having the teacher in the room meant that things didn't usually get off the rails too far. The teacher could come in and interrupt or guide people so that everyone in the space felt safe enough to be there. But as our community was evolving and growing, there were places and times where people were getting together on their own in a group that did not have a local teacher. And these became far more important at that point because people like the idea of mutuality. I think it really speaks to that need in people to have a safe space to come forward and share and listen and learn from one another. And that whole meeting and being met framework runs deep. People crave it. So naturally people wanted to form local groups. And yet, without knowing how to exactly do it, some of those things that undermine safety were often happening. You'd have somebody who decided they needed to have a teacher, and whether or not they really understood mutuality, they might come in and dominate the space. Or they might come in with having everybody talk philosophy instead of really connecting. So that's another reason why these came forward, as community building was becoming more established in various places around the country and around the world.
No, it sounds great. Like you said, they came into effect because of need.
Yes, because of need, and because of growing and hearing about these groups that started out with the best of intentions and then fell apart.
Yeah.
They imploded some way or other, or fizzled, or people just drifted off because they weren't really getting that need met, and they weren't feeling.
Yeah, thank you, Cielle, also, because I'm remembering, because one of the ways that I did work with you so many years ago was that we had a group of people that would gather together in Fairfield together in a room, and then we would call you you'd be on a speakerphone, and we also would say CC's in the box. We didn't even have Zoom or Skype back then, so we'd have CC in the box in the middle of the floor. But what happened was that and we met with you for years, but we just templated off of you. You showed us by example what it was to hold people, to reflect to them. And that group to this day is still meeting. We meet as peers, and but we didn't need to actually get out a document of guidelines for practical mutuality, because we did have a teacher that we could just watch in action. But it took us years of sort of watching, what would CC say, things like that we felt like we were comfortable that we might make a similar reflection. But there's so many areas that people, if we had not had the benefit of being able to have you with us week after week, and we'd just been on our own to guess what it was that you were doing that was so effective, I don't think the group would have held together as it did. So and I think that's part of what I'm hoping that we can share with people, is that if you don't have a teacher that you can meet with, but you do have a group of peers, that you can still learn through reading and listening and asking what works. And that's part of the reason why I'm interviewing you today, so you can share some tips with people. But yeah, I was fortunate to have did the templating way, as opposed to the way that you can actually just learn, though, by reading and investigating what works.
Right, brilliant. Yes, that was really an amazing group that met for such a long time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't without its challenges at times.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And I think it's important to say mutuality, due to its nature, because we are dealing with real human beings, with real broken zones, at some point or other generally manages to get messy. And people's feelings get hurt, and sense of trust gets undermined. And then it's really important to have resources. It's good to know that we do have lots of resources within this community of teachers who can help work through messy places. So even if you are doing a peer group, you can know that there are resources you can turn to if things get wonky, and they will. Actually, getting messy is one of the ways people really deepen in mutuality. I find is that when you were speaking about reading, so I want to spend just a second to say, in this book, Becoming Divinely Human, there's a whole chapter dedicated to mutuality and love trust. And I that way because mutuality is one of the best ways to learn what love trust is and cultivate it within yourself and within your. So there's a whole chapter, and it's too long to quote from directly right now, but it's there and available for everyone to pick up a copy of the book and delve a little more deeply into some of the principles and practices and reasoning behind works done consciously. I will read, if I may, the first line from the guidelines, which refers back to what we said earlier. Keep in mind that the foremost principle guiding mutuality groups, whether in person or online, is that everyone is fundamentally already okay, exactly as they are, no matter what aspect of their total being is arising at any moment. So that's where it starts, and that's kind of where it ends. And then there's ways we can with each other to.
Yeah, all of that stuff that's in the middle between recognizing that everyone is exactly where they are supposed to be, and
right. And mutuality, it's easy to idealize mutuality. It's easy, just even on hearing the word, for it to sound like, oh yeah, here's a safe space where I can go and I can be exactly who I am, and everybody's going to love me and treat me nicely, people, and behave according to whatever my idea for an enlightened being is. And that means, heaven forbid they be angry at me. So it's important to say about mutuality is that it's, bring it down to earth, live it in reality with people. It's about real humans getting in the room together and being raw and being vulnerable and getting into difficult places. And these are just ways of kind of smoothing through the ways that we inherently miss one another. Because naturally, my framework and my references aren't the same as yours. So I have my truth, you have your truth, they have their truth, and they're different. And that difference is uncomfortable. And out of the discomfort, that's one of the main reasons why people want to fix each other. It's like, don't make me uncomfortable. I'm going to tell you how to go fix yourself, so I can feel more relaxed and safe. And mutuality is learning to take a breath and be in that place that there's a little discomfort, there's a little challenge inherent in the fact that their truth is coming from their life and their experience and their natural attributes, and it's going to be a little different than mine. And so what we want to do is find a way to initiate the conversations that embrace or encompass that understanding of how we are trying to in the space together. You know, we're trying. We may not do it perfect. We won't do it perfect. Guaranteed we won't be perfect. How can we be in the space together in a way that fully supports people and helps them awaken fully to all that they are? So you invited me earlier to say a few things that support that. And so let me hit a couple of the highlights. One, you can make I rather than you statements if you get triggered by something. So very simple, but to say, I feel however I'm feeling now. I'm feeling upset. I'm feeling agitated. I'm feeling like I want to run out of the room. Instead of saying, you made me feel really angry, or you made me feel upset. So take it home, bring it back to yourself, and it doesn't have to be laid on the other person. And it can be within a context of, as I heard you speaking, this is what arose in me. But then you're still claiming it for yourself because your reaction is unique to you. Of course, be respectful of people's shares and their posts. Oh my God, posts. Mutuality becomes so important on online communications, forums. It's so easy if the person's not right in front of you to project onto them or treat them as if they weren't a sensitive, real, live human. So these guidelines are even more important when you're doing it through social media. Here's another point. Be willing to vulnerably reveal yourself to the group. And yet, it's not something you have to force yourself to do before you're ready. Trust deepens, and when you feel safe enough to do so. Just know that there's value in that, and that you're allowed to determine when. And it's also okay to decline feedback. You can invite it and say, I'd love to hear a reflection from people, but it's also sometimes what you share is really tender and you just don't want to hear any feedback right at that moment. So we want people to feel empowered, do it how it works for them. And everybody's unique. Here's another one. Avoid labeling other people or referring to them as their personality type. You know, their enneatype or their human design type. As if this explains why they are as they are. Because people are way more than whatever types they are. Now, you may be studying this kind of thing. You may be finding value in it. It may be giving you insights into some aspect of your own behavior, and you're welcome to talk about your own. But to say that that person's a type 1 and therefore that explains everything they do, and put somebody in a box that's not accurate. It's not enough. And will cause you to shut down. It'll cause you to turn off the deep listening. Because you'll be thinking, I already know why they do what they do. So we want to walk that back some. And be useful in learning and talking about if you're exploring together, and yet don't reduce people. Know that everybody is a constellation of many attributes. Do you have any favorite guidelines?
Well, this is kind of maybe obvious, but it's sometimes overlooked, and that's confidentiality. You know, that in a group that we have really strict agreements. That's another way. It is a rule, I would say. There's usually very strict agreements about confidentiality. And And that really gives people the freedom to know that they can really share some very tender material, knowing that it will be kept sacred just within those few moments of it being shared, and not be, brought outside the circle. And I also like to extend confidentiality, to be sensitive that if a group meets regularly, to not even expect someone will go back to similar material. Like, so in other words, that we wouldn't ask. I wouldn't say, hey, Cece, how are you doing on that, that conversation that you had last week with your boss? You just like, that was for Cece to bring up at the time. And it's not for me to pry in to, because often that happens. It's again in my need of curiosity, of wanting to find out what's going on in her life. It's like, if it's up for her, I trust that it will come up and be revealed. So again, that confidentiality outside the circle, that we don't share what we've heard, we can speak about ourselves. But even I like to extend it, that we just hold sacred what someone else said, and not to pry, into those tender parts, just out of curiosity, and let it arise for them organically.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. That's a critical rule, along with not fixing, is holding things in sacred confidentiality.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing along that line would be, it often happens as you're listening to someone, they'll bring up something that reminds you of something in your own life. And it's so tempting to say, I had that very same thing happen to me, blah, 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 blah. And then it's all about me wanting to talk about my experience. And that's not bad. It's not wrong. But be sensitive and don't do it while it's their turn. And they're having their turn. If you do that, you're going to cut off some of their exploration, their self-exploration, and you're going to take the attention away from them back to yourself. So if it happens, if something gets activated in you like that, save it for your turn. And then you can explore it if that's what's important to you. But while you're listening, it's better not to jump in on what they're saying. Some of the things that are good to do are to just maybe ask a clarifying question. And you can even ask if it's okay for you to ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be okay for me to ask something I didn't quite get that? I don't think I heard you fully. And the person has, give them the right to say, sure, go ahead and ask, or no, not right now. I want to sit with what I'm exploring. Sometimes people need a lot of space because this is an embodiment process. There's so much information we get by tuning inward to what we're sensing, feeling, sensing, the felt senses on the inner body level. And that's one of the reasons why we give people space to talk, and also to even have gaps in their speaking as they sense inward and maybe find another level of whatever they're exploring. And that's one of the ways we respect people and give them an invitation to bring even more forward.
Yeah, we consider the silence to be just as sacred as the words.
Yes, yes. And this is something that you cultivate with practice. I want to say these are written out as guidelines with the intention of people actually referring back to the list from time to time and reminding themselves, because in average human interactions, the temptation is so much there to jump in, to fill the space, to try to be the one who's right, or win the argument, or whatever we do. A lot of habitual ways of relating that don't support mutuality.
Yeah, thank you so much for also mentioning this, as a practice, because some people feel a little bit lost in the Trillium work because we don't have, for instance, a sitting meditation that we recommend. Many people do meditate, but we don't have very many practices. Like we have our gazing meditation, but to really understand that we practice mutuality, and there are some guidelines for that practice, and it's through this mutuality being one, like you said, one of the petals of the trillium flower. It's not just a little leaf in the background. It's actually one of the main parts of our work, and it can be practiced. It can be practiced very fully in groups that are dedicated to a mutuality circle or in a sitting with a teacher. But we can also practice it in just sort of day-to-day life with our family and friends and things like that. But it is something that doesn't always come naturally to us because we haven't been modeled this kind of being in relationship with people. But to practice, it makes it, oh, okay, this is the path of awakening. This is the practice that we offer that isn't offered by very many other spiritual organizations. So just appreciate that you're underlying that for
I
us.
don't know of any other organization that is doing mutuality the way we do.
Yeah, I agree. Not the way we do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that they don't have some version of it, but we do it in a way that's very conscious and has evolved as a result of lived experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And not through an idealized let's turn everybody into ideal people, but through lived experience of let's get in the room, let's awake, let's all be as big as we naturally unleash ourselves to be. But then you get a room full of very big people, and they're gonna start bouncing against one another, and that's okay. That's okay as long as you learn how to do that in a way that respects their bigness as well as your own bigness.
Right.
And then it gets really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then it gets really fun and really sublime. Not just fun, but sublime. I mean, it really is awakening in practice. I mean, it's just the way awakening can truly
Mm-hmm.
flourish and blossom and create relationships that are beyond anything that you might have experienced in the past. Deep and sweet and loving and also hot and passionate and opinionated, as well, as much as they need to be in order for that person to express the totality of their being. And yet always coming from, and we haven't maybe spoken this directly, but coming from a fundamental knowing that that person I'm with is not separate from me.
Mm-hmm.
So we used to say really had to be awake before you could fully do mutuality. And that's maybe true, maybe not true. People are learning to do mutuality at whatever level of awakening they're having. And yet that awakening, that where you get, oh my gosh, I can't hurt that person without also hurting myself. You get tenderized to that. Maybe it's, it's shackled, to that person in a way you don't want to be. But that's the reality, is that we're really not separate here. And so once you start to live that as your truth, as what you know deep in your being, then mutuality flows from that place and doesn't need practicing, doesn't need the guidelines. It comes from that place of true depth of connection and love that you have for the other and for yourself as well. One and the other, they're not, neither is more important than the other. They're both equally important.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you brought this back to that non-separateness. that awakening on this particular path is one of non-separateness. And that doesn't include not just non-separateness from our conscious nature, which often is a precursor to an embodied awakening, but that non-separateness with all of creation, and including our fellow persons on this path of awakening, and that truly we can fully be really fully be who we are when we are truly making room for the other to be fully who they are. And that really reaches a pinnacle when that embodied awakening becomes more and more established, so that sense of non-separateness is very, very much there in the front all of the time. Because then how could we possibly not make room for the other? Just like we learn to make room for ourselves, our own true and total nature, but recognizing that I am non-separate from them, distinct and yet not separate. We, of course, will make room for the other, while it still paradoxically is messy.
Yep. Oh, yep. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's about what I have now. I do want to mention, as well as reference pieces, there's a guideline for conflict resolution that I think is quite useful. And then there's a little more in-depth guideline for coconut yoga that is very useful when it really feels like somebody has stepped on your toes, and you just aren't going to be able to let it go. There are ways to bring that communication to the other person consciously. So I think we're not going to talk about that just now, but I will plant a seed for maybe another time when we will.
I am very happy to hear that. I would love to, because I know also were one of the first documents that I read about coconut yoga was one that you had created. And I know it wasn't a concept that you created on your own, but you really were able to write about it in a very accessible way. So I'd love to have you back here again, and we'll talk about coconut yoga. And thank you for also mentioning that we do have guidelines for conflict resolution. Several of our teachers have been trained as mediators.
Yes.
For conflict. So you keep mentioning we have resources over these years of this teacher circle getting to be more and more awake. Basically, as we can progress in our awakening, we become more resourceful in terms of being able to support students in their awakening. So we are gathering resources and want to make them available to students.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the origin and practical value of and blessings to each and every person who's embarking on the journey of mutuality, finding themselves deepening in that. I think the more we practice it, the more it becomes our way of to our families, to our loved ones, to our children, to our coworkers, and the world is really enriched by it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cece, for joining me today, and I look forward to having you back again soon.
Will do.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.